Okay, let's talk about one of the most important thinkers you've probably never heard of. Seriously. He's been called the last great mind of the Middle Ages, and his ideas were so radical, they didn't just rock the boat. They helped spark the Protestant Reformation and completely redefined what it even means to know something. His name was Gregory of Rimini. And right away, we run into this massive contradiction. How on earth does one guy get the nickname Lucerna Splendens, which means the splendid light, and at the same time, the absolutely horrifying title of torturer of infants? In this explainer, we're going to dig into that very question and uncover the radical ideas of a man who really truly did shape history. So, to figure this all out, we first have to get to know the man himself, a figure of some pretty fascinating contradictions, who was living and working at this perfect storm of a moment in intellectual history. I mean, just look at the names people gave him. On one hand, his supporters called him the Splendid Light and the Sharp Doctor, because they celebrated the incredible clarity and rigor of his arguments. But on the other hand, you have that shocking nickname, and that alone tells you just how challenging and, for some people, how terrifying his ideas must have been. Now, that title, the last great scholastic theologian, that didn't just come out of nowhere. To really get a handle on his impact, we have to appreciate the intellectual fireworks he was walking right into. Born around the year 1300 in Rimini, Italy, Gregory was an Augustinian hermit who would end up right at the epicenter of European thought. The thing is, Gregory wasn't just making things up in a vacuum. He was standing at this really unique crossroads of European philosophy, and that position allowed him to do something nobody had ever done before. Back in the early 14th century, philosophy in Europe was kind of split between two rival powerhouses. You had Paris, where the ideas of Peter Oriol were king, but then across the English Channel at Oxford, this brand new super sharp logic was coming out from thinkers like William of Ockham. So when Gregory shows up in Paris in the 1340s, he does something totally new. He's the first thinker to really grab both traditions and smash them together, creating something completely new. And bringing these two worlds together, well, it forced him to wrestle with some of theology's absolute toughest questions. From the Oxford School, he grabbed this new focus on logic, on the sentences we use to describe the world. And from the Paris School, he inherited this intense focus on God's absolute simple power. And it was the combination of these two, pushed by his relentless demand for consistency, that led him straight to his most radical and most infamous idea. And here we go. This is how he earned that absolutely shocking nickname. It all boils down to his incredibly uncompromising views on predestination and God's absolute power. He took this verse from the Apostle Paul, and this became the bedrock of his whole argument. Now, for Gregory, this wasn't some kind of metaphor. No way. He saw it as a literal statement of divine fact, and he was prepared to follow its logic wherever it led, no matter how controversial. This led him right to the theory of double predestination. That's the idea that God doesn't just choose who gets saved, he also actively chooses who is damned. And he does this before they're even born, with absolutely no regard for their future actions. This is it. This is where he got that awful nickname. But you have to ask, why would he believe something so harsh? Well, for Gregory, it wasn't about being cruel. It was about pure, cold, logical consistency. Okay, so here's how his logic worked. The standard view at the time was lopsided, right? Humans, through their own sin, could cause their damnation, but only God's grace could cause salvation. Thinkers like Peter Oriol were already pointing out that logically, this doesn't really hold up. Gregory agreed. He saw that inconsistency and just took the next radical step. He argued that to be truly consistent, God's will has to be the only cause of both salvation and damnation. In his view, if God's power is absolute, then it's the ultimate cause of everything, the good and the bad. And this demand for precision, it wasn't just in his theology. It also pushed him toward a really groundbreaking idea about what we can truly know and what the object of science or knowledge really is. This got him tangled up in a huge debate of his time. When you have a piece of knowledge, a simple fact like the sky is blue, what is that knowledge actually about? Is it about the physical sky out there, or is it about the sentence, the words floating around in your mind? Gregory's answer, which was inspired by his colleagues, really changed the whole conversation. So Occam had argued that science is about the proposition, the sentence in our heads. Walter Chatton argued no, it's about the thing itself, the state of affairs in the real world. Gregory looked at both of these and rejected them. Instead, he adopted a third way, an idea that was developed by his contemporary, Adam Wodehouse. He argued for something called the complex significability. Now, this is a tricky concept, so bear with me. It's not the physical thing itself, and it's not the words you're using to describe it. It's the total state of affairs that makes your sentence either true or false. Let's take that sentence. The sky is blue. The object of your knowledge, according to Gregory, isn't the sky, and it isn't the words. It's simply the fact of the skies being blue. I know, it seems a little abstract, but this idea created a whole new level of precision. It built a sort of firewall between the language we use and the reality that language is trying to describe. So, why does a 14th century monk still matter? I mean, what's the lasting impact of all these demanding and, let's be honest, pretty difficult ideas? Well, his influence was huge. To get a sense of it, just consider this one number. 6. That's how many times his major work, his commentary on the sentences, was printed in just the first 50 years of the printing press. This thing was a certified bestseller. It became a core text in universities like Vienna, and his thinking spread to major figures like Pierre de Ailly. But most importantly, his work landed directly in the hands of two of the most disruptive figures in all of European history, Martin Luther and John Calvin. And it's no exaggeration to say this. You can draw a direct, straight line from Gregory's brand of what's been called extreme Augustinianism, especially his views on double predestination, straight to the core theological beliefs that lit the fuse of the Protestant Reformation a century and a half later. And this surprisingly modern way of thinking, it wasn't just in his theology. You see it even in his economics. He defined usury, that's making an illegal profit from a loan, not by the transaction itself, but by the intent behind it. You see that? This focus on internal states, on what's going on inside a person's mind and their conscience. That's the modern thread that runs through all of his work, from theology to finance. All of which leaves us with a final, really interesting question. Gregory of Rimini was called the last great scholastic of the Middle Ages, but he was also a clear intellectual forerunner of the Reformation, which we often think of as the start of the modern world. His life and his work, they show us that these clean lines we try to draw in history, between medieval and modern, they're often way blurrier and, frankly, a lot more interesting than we think.